I'd like to welcome everybody to our second, I call them Zoominar. The first one was with famed economist Art Laffer. And I just want to make sure that on behalf of the entire team at Phillips and Company Advisors, we hope you're all safe and well. I know this is a very smoky time and a chaotic time with pandemic and certainly fires here in Oregon and Kevin's in California. Obviously our thoughts and prayers are with all of you. I'd like to just remind everybody that they can post their questions on the Q&A button at the lower right. I'll fire those at Kevin. And then of course our speaker's views are his own and may not necessarily represent our views unless he says something really smart. Then it's our view. So we'll take some credit. Let me just introduce all of you to Kevin Xu. He's the founder of the Bilingual Interconnected newsletter, and you can find that on interconnected.blog. It's a technology kind of global corporate newsletter that really leans into what's going on in China, and that's very helpful. He was born in Shenyang, if I'm saying that right, Kevin, which was the former capital of Manchuria. He came to Canada at a very young age, served in the White House and Department of Commerce in the Obama administration. He's an investor and advisor in technology startups in the US, China, and around the world. I'm super excited to have Kevin kind of peel back the onion on what we think is the most important geopolitical issue of our time, that, kind of call it China-US tech relations. So Kevin, thanks for being here. We're excited to have you. Can you just explain to our audience, what's all this US-China Cold War, tech Cold War really about? This public battle that started with Huawei can't easily be about, streaming Netflix faster. It's got to be more to that. Also, can you comment on how this Cold War is ensnaring companies like ByteDance, TikTok, big players like Tencent, Alibaba, and SMIC?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, Tim, for inviting me and to speak to your audience about all these really important issues. And for those of you who want to get in touch with me, you can probably see the contact information right to my left. I made this background literally just before I hop on the call, mostly to hide the boxes behind me because my wife and I just moved to Tahoe temporarily from the Bay Area because of the smoke and everything. But as my political training had me think previously, never waste a blank background. So let's get into some of these really important topics that you brought up, Tim. First of all, as far as this Cold War moniker is concerned, let's walk back a little bit, even maybe just 4 years ago, right? When we first started the Trump administration, a lot of this conflict with China has been brewing really previous to the Trump administration. So I don't want this to be like a specifically Trump thing per se. During the Obama administration, during the Bush administration, there's been a lot of debate about our trade relationship with China, about market access. And we have obviously been on the front of free trade. And this whole conflict that we are currently in now with China really started as a trade war first and foremost, right? So this is more like a Smoot-Hawley style conflict to begin with, right? Erecting barriers here and there, tit for tat. And that quickly evolved into a technology conflict. And I think there are a few reasons why that's so. First of all, on a much higher kind of macro level, technology is just permeating everybody's lives, whether we know it or not. So even though you were saying this jokingly about streaming Netflix faster, it kind of is about that, to be honest with you, if we're talking about 5G specifically, right, which we will, of course, discuss more in detail a little bit later. But it became a technology war because, number one, the United States is still the technology leader in the world by a pretty long shot. But that shot or that mileage or that distance is shrinking pretty quickly because China has been trying to catch up to that gap. And that makes sense, of course, from the Chinese economy's perspective, because it's one of the largest, it is the largest population in the world. It has so many people, and they are trying to really boost their technological advancement to increase their citizens' productivity, actually. And we can get into that a little bit later on a granular level as well. And I want to hone in on Huawei specifically because that is sort of the one company that kind of encapsulates a lot of this conflict, or is the kind of the tip of the spear, or the victim, or however you want to think about it. And I think a little bit of history might help. For those of you who aren't aware of the company's history per se, it was founded in 1987. And that is 3 years after Cisco, which was founded in 1984. And really from the very beginning of Huawei, it's being the Chinese Cisco, right? Because Cisco is such a revolutionary company in terms of networking and modem and really like kind of the backbone of the internet as we know it, right? It's kind of powered a lot by Cisco, obviously telecom, cellular, all these sorts of hardware. And Huawei is that for China in the beginning, right? And even internationally, there are lots of stories of Cisco and Huawei fighting for the same contract in countries outside of either China or the United States. Now, fast forward to now, Huawei as a company is basically both Cisco and Apple / Samsung when it comes to smartphones, and a little bit of Qualcomm, and it has its own cloud business as well. There's a Huawei cloud. It's kind of like an AWS, but much smaller, right? So while Cisco is still basically Cisco, unfortunately, Huawei is becoming this incredibly huge technology company, right? I think their annual revenue from 2019 was around 120 billion United States dollars. So wow. If you were to trade that company tomorrow, if it goes IPO on any market, I don't care what it is, conservatively, the market cap will be about $1 trillion, given the multiples that we're seeing in the market right now, right? And because they have their hands in so many of these businesses, and also really kind of full stack, right? From the consumer technology, the phone that we can use in our hand, all the way down to the actual chip design that's inside the phone. They have their own thing as well. And also the 5G stations that they're building in China and potentially other countries, but we can get into the conflict a little bit later on that. They are much more fully or kind of vertically integrated than a lot of even the competitors that we are seeing in the United States and in Europe. And that's why it's such a big target for the current round of sanctions. And as we've seen, it's also very, it has its weak spots as well, right? It doesn't control everything. And because of the semiconductor sanctions that we are seeing from the Commerce Department specifically, it is having a lot of trouble right now with the next phase of its product roadmap to be able to deliver on all the promises and the products that it has to its customers. So I'm going to stop there real quick to see if you have any follow-ups. Obviously, we haven't gotten to Alibaba and all these other companies yet, but I want to pause a bit to see what you have on your mind, Tim.
Yeah, so just on behalf of everybody on the phone, make sure you drop your Q&A in. That's part of our plan. So Kevin, this Huawei, kind of iconic, shiny figure, it's not just about that. How far behind are we, the United States, in this 5G race? And what is 5G really? I mean, I know we're talking about streaming, but there seems to be like an industrial use to this network that's got everybody rattled around the world. Am I going with the China Huawei usage, or am I going to use the Qualcomm, US version of 5G infrastructure? And I don't even know much about that. So Kevin, unpack that a little bit on what 5G is going to be used for and why it's such a big deal.
Right. So the G in 5G it just stands for the word generation, right? So this is the 5th generation cellular network kind of protocol or specification. So previously we had 4G, right? We had 3G. I remember when I first got my iPhone, I had like a 2G little thing on my phone as well. And for the most part, in plain terms, the 5G label is just a much faster cellular capacity, right? So in a way, to come back to a more kind of a grounded example, if I were to go into a rural area in the United States, for example, and I do want to watch Netflix and I don't have Wi-Fi, a 5G enabled United States would allow me to watch my favorite show much more smoothly than a 4G network, right? Or even a 3G network, of course. But there's much more to it because 5G right now, first of all, is still being shaped, right? Whatever this set of standards or specification is, and every G has its own set of standards, it's still being shaped for 5G. But what it enables now is not just kind of the internet usage that we use right now, but it enables better Internet of Things capabilities, so IoT smart devices. So think of that as like smart fridge or smart TV. You can definitely put the self-driving revolution in there, right? If you were to drive a self-driving Tesla or whatever the other products are there out there, you want a 5G country so that when you drive in rural Nevada, you can still get the directions and the software updates and whatever the software the car needs to drive itself, right? That is basically like a bandwidth issue. So if you don't remember anything I just said, just think of 5G as like a thicker pipe that can put in more data than a 4G pipe, and then like a 3G pipe being, narrower. And then there is a 6G as well that is being debated kind of farther in advance into the future. And kind of coming back to the United States angle, right now, if you were to like build a 5G network or a 5G country from scratch, your best bets in terms of the companies that can do it for you are Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia.
Yeah.
So there's no American companies in that roster, right? And, Qualcomm is definitely in the conversation because they make the modem, the little chip that enables your phone to talk 5G with the cellular towers. But they don't make the cellular towers, right? They don't make the so-called base station, which is the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that you need to have this 5G-enabled economy before the phone can actually be a 5G phone.
Yeah. So Kevin, help me think through this. It used to be that countries would side with America fairly easily because they would gain access to our middle class markets, and they would also fall under our national security umbrella. And I know you know this because you were at the White House and at Commerce. Today, it seems like China's offering the world access to their rapidly growing middle class. Call that, you can access national security from the United States, or you can have access to growing your country through piping in to the Chinese middle class. Is that how you see kind of the division in the world, like where countries are siding in this whole debate? And maybe it's spilling into, we look at it as 5G, but it's really a bigger context than just who's going to build their 5G network in their country?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a much larger geopolitical chess match that's going on for, let's just call it, the rest of the world, which is a little unfair to them because, they're people, they have their goals and their dreams. It's not just China or the US, right? But I do think there is an element of that, which is, number one, there is the access to market, right? So you can kind of crudely think of China as the place you make money, right? Because of the number of people and the rapidly growing economy. And then you can think of the United States as your security umbrella, the places that if S hits the fan, this is where you run to. This is where you can protect your values and your safety and whatnot. Now, what I think is emerging, and this has kind of been emerging in the foreign policy kind of circle for a while now, but now it's becoming more fully blown, is there a China model and a United States model? And if I were a rest of the world country, let's just say, are these two actually now legitimate choices that I can choose from? Right? Like before, there's really only one way to kind of advance your own economy. If you're like a backwater middle income country, it'd be like, well, of course I'm gonna look at the United States or like Western Europe. Like this is the way to give my citizens and my country a way out of poverty, right? And now you have possibly another option, which is, okay, let's look at what Beijing has done in the last 40 years, right? Since its, opening and reform. While they've done pretty well too, there's certainly a lot of problems with what they're doing, but perhaps this is another option. And for me to subscribe to that option, maybe I will need access to not just the Chinese market, but also allow Chinese government or Chinese tech companies or just other kinds of companies to invest in my economy to grow the way I want it to grow. And you see a lot of this example in Southeast Asia, actually, which is one of the most interesting and dynamic region that I find personally, because physically they are literally in the middle. And culturally, there's obviously a lot of American influence from the Cold War, like the actual Cold War, right, that we've had previously. Right. And then now because of the proximity with China and also like much longer cultural ties with the Chinese kind of Han culture that dates back like hundreds of years, they just absorb both. Yeah. Like them, they don't have like a preconceived notion of which one's better or worse. They're just like, well, we're just gonna see what happens. We're trying to survive in this world, literally in the middle. And then you see a lot of amalgamations of development kind of strategy or like national industrial policy in Southeast Asia that is a blend of both the American way of doing things and also the so-called Chinese way of doing things.
Interesting. Hey, let's throw up a survey real quick and see what our participants say. Michelle, would you kindly throw up our survey? And our first survey, we're going to do a couple of these. And really the survey questions, how concerned are you with China gaining regional or global dominance over the United States? And while they're taking that, Kevin, talk about technology, China's technology policy as part of a broader game plan for, a desire for hegemony in the region or the world. Is their tech policy part of their broader game plan, or is it just a byproduct?
Mm-hmm. So I think hegemony as a term is maybe overstating their plan a little bit, and even their actual capability, to be honest. Like the United States is still the hegemony, or the hegemon rather, by a long shot, and like I said, in a lot of ways. That being said, China is aggressively from the very top investing, promoting, technology advancement domestically, because one, I think there is a clear demographic issue, which is that even though the country has a massive population, it's aging very quickly. It kind of a byproduct of the one-child policy, which I am actually a member of. When I was born in China in 1986, I was a one-child person. My mom couldn't have a second one unless she kind of pays a massive fine that's like 8 times her annual income or something, right? Yep. And now because of that, we have an aging population in China right now, and they need technology to boost their productivity. Otherwise, the economy is actually going to collapse, right? There's just not enough people working or like producing or like doing stuff. So there are domestic needs for their advancement of technology. And number two, there is this kind of leapfrog effect with developing countries in general, and you're seeing that in China as well, which is that the nice thing about developing technology first is you can kind of leapfrog a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense for your country, right? So if you travel to China, there's hardly any credit cards in people's hands. It's just kind of like mobile payment out of your phone, right? And they do kind of credit and loan and other kind of stuff in different ways, like out of the app, whether it's like Alibaba's Alipay or WeChat's payment and whatever. So that is another element in which technology is very, very important for, again, domestic development, like regardless of kind of what is happening in the United States. And then thirdly, I do think there is a very strong element now that China sees its moment, literally. If you read some of the policy documents coming out of China recently, when it comes to the Made in China 2025 plan, the new infrastructure stimulus plan that just came out recently because of COVID-19, they see a juxtaposition right now between kind of the money printing QE way of doing things, which is mostly what's happening in the United States, and a state-directed investment of a bunch of strategic areas that the government thinks will be important for its future kind of growth. And, there are 8 areas I'm just gonna kind of shout out at people, right? So people kind of have in the back of their mind, which is AI, it's 5G, it's cloud computing, it's Internet of Things, it's AR, VR, it's blockchain, autonomous devices, so self-driving and stuff like that, And then this other thing called like industrial internet, which is kind of like a weird catch-all of like some other things.
Yeah, Lacey, Michelle, put that up. Will you put that slide up on China 2025 so our audience can see while Kevin walks through some of this, because that's a good segue. And just so you can see, Kevin, the survey results are split between very concerned and moderately concerned. Mm-hmm. And everybody can kind of see that. It's very interesting that it's kind of an even split there. But Kevin, I didn't mean to interrupt. Let's get back to this China 2025 initiative that seems to have spooked a lot of people in the world when China said, we're going to lean into some things, and talk about this a little bit, will you please?
Yeah. So I want to put the China 2025 plan, or Made in China 2025 plan specifically in context. So first of all, China has been obviously making a lot of stuff on the lower end of, the entire world's economy, right? The socks that we wear, the shirts that we wear, textile, like small electronics, and it's slowly but surely moving up kind of the value chain. But as far as like very high tech product is concerned, let's just take semiconductor, for example, which is obviously in the news right now with Huawei and everything. Most of what Chinese domestic manufacturers can do is still very much on the lower end of the value chain. So literally like testing the semiconductor, or like packaging it, or kind of assembling it. They don't make it, they don't design it, and they see why that's a big weakness. So part of this initiative, this 2025 thing, is to boost that capacity from like an advanced manufacturing perspective within China. And you can kind of see that play out in the different lens, because all these sanctions on Huawei, but also on some of the other kind of chip foundries, semiconductor manufacturers that exist in China, they are getting screwed, essentially. Like they're very much hurting because of that weakness that this plan is supposed to rectify. But from like a PR perspective, perhaps they've kind of promoted a little bit too much, because that spooked the rest of the world. It'd be like, oh, what are they trying to do, right? And the thing is, right now, it's not a whole lot. And if you look at the details of this plan, the goal of this plan, roughly speaking, is for domestic manufacturers of things like semiconductor, whether it's like memory or like kind of CPUs, to be, close to 50% of the supplier in the domestic market in China. Which means realistically, even by 2025, if they were to just perfectly execute this thing, 50% of the demand will be provided by domestic suppliers in China, and the other 50, they still have to buy from foreign manufacturers, right? So
Kevin, keep going, but handicap that. Can China as a country and as a political platform execute on marshaling the resources to do just that? 50% domestic production supplied. Yeah. Could they pull that off?
So I'm going to kind of sector that into two layers. There's the really hard stuff that they have a hard time making, which is the processors, right? The stuff that the CPUs, GPUs. And then there's the slightly lower end semiconductor stuff, which is memory. Like RAMs and, storage and whatever. That they could potentially make some headway because the technology barrier is a little bit lower. And to put that in kind of a larger context for everybody, there's a lot that you can't buy with money when it comes to higher end manufacturing. Right. And this is where I still see huge advantages in the American economy and the American system if we were to actually make good use of it. Because, there's certain parts where it is very capital intensive, like the facilities and the manufacturing and the blah, 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 blah. Right. But a lot of this is very important R&D, very important intellectual property. Right. And for those of you who might have had some experience with the Chinese economy, intellectual property as a concept is still, let's just call it evolving. Like it used to be whatever. Like I have used bootleg Microsoft Windows when I was still living in China. I was like 8 years old or something, right? It's like you just buy it on the street. It's like $1, right? And now it's getting better. And the reason why it's getting better is because it has to get better, because otherwise you simply cannot have pure self-sufficiency when it comes to technology. Your ceiling is going to hit. At some point, you will have to license other people's IP, which currently, for all the Huawei chips that we were talking about as powering their phone, they still have to license ARM technology from the UK, which I guess could be American if NVIDIA buys the company, kind of late breaking news, but they still have to license Qualcomm. They have to license all these things that they don't have, right? And China still kind of buys $300 billion worth of chips from foreign suppliers every single year for the last 2 years, and maybe this year as well, depending on the sanctions. So that's kind of the handicap, I'd say, is that there's a lot of pomp and circumstances. There are going to be some eye-popping numbers up to the trillions of investment, which is important to pay attention to. And another element I want to just kind of scratch a little bit lightly on is the domestic way of executing on these plans, which is several layers of government, from central government to provincial government, right? And governors of certain provinces who really want to kind of advance their career into the central government, they're going to fight for these resources. And then you kind of filter that down to actual companies that are going to want to be getting a piece of the pie of the subsidies and the government investment and the private dollars that fall into it. And there are still very much layers of corruption and waste in that process, and we are already seeing some of that example as well, just within kind of the narrow confines of semiconductor manufacturers that China is trying to build domestically.
Yeah. So let's pause there. I want to ask you a question from one of our participants, and forgive me because it's very technical, but is there a parallel between the Japan, Taiwan, South Korea eventual acceptance of Western IP protection to today's China? That is, will they eventually work out the IP problem as the others did?
In terms of whether China will kind of follow the path of South Korea or Japan,
yeah,
and whatnot. I think depending on your time horizon, they will figure it out eventually. It's just a matter of during that time, during the figuring out time, will the economy take a real hit? Will companies like Huawei take a real financial hit while they trying to go through lean times, basically, to figure that out? And this is, I think, kind of objectively speaking, where a more government involved, let's just say industrial policy, could have an advantage. And if you look at Japan, you look at South Korea, you look at Taiwan, the government, the central government of these territories, these countries, are very involved in kind of growing their domestic champions, right? I think there's a term that folks might want to kind of just have in their head, is this concept called national champion. Right? We don't really have that in the United States until recently, because it's like free market. Like we don't kind of pick and choose winners from the government, right? But these countries do, right? Samsung and SD Hynix and LGs, they are the domestic champions of South Korea, right? You obviously have a collection of that in Japan as well, like Toshiba and like others. In Taiwan, right now, the big one is TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, right? That was built, I think, in the 1980s, specifically as an invitation from like the Ministry of so-and-so in the Taiwanese government at the time to invite top-notch Taiwanese American scientists who've been working in Texas Instruments, in AMD, in Qualcomm, to come back to their homeland and be like, hey, build this thing for us, please.
Yeah,
right?
Very fascinating.
I guess like for a long time, the United States has never had that kind of approach to development, and we didn't really need to. And you will see that, you're already seeing that a lot in China from like other sectors, but you will see more aggressively probably them trying to attract talent back from not just the United States, but Western Europe, like kind of the Scandinavian countries, where a lot of these IPs do exist currently, and come back to develop their so-called domestic economy. And our immigration policy probably kind of inadvertently is helping with that by not being very friendly to other people coming to our country right now.
Yeah. So Michelle, put up the subsidy slides. I want to set this next question up as a little bit of a teeter-totter. Let's put up these subsidy slides. So in America, I'm not sure what that one is, but that's in America, we don't really always think about an industrial policy. As you know, Kevin, we're always like free market, capitalist, capital flows. But then you look at things like defense spending. That seems to me like an industrial policy. You've got these 700 to 800 billions of dollars functionally trickling into our economy. Next slide, Michelle. And then you've got things like farm subsidies. This is a map that shows every farm that receives $1 million or more in farm subsidies. Then you roll into healthcare, and while we couldn't break up, the recipients of Medicare, but this is, again, in that 1 point some odd trillion dollars of federal spending that goes into healthcare. And you can pull those down. Kevin, talk about China's industrial policy. And then I'm going to just talk about how that works in China, their industrial policy. And then maybe we talk about, will America need to adopt a laser-focused tech industrial policy that comes with massive subsidies to play the game, the China, US, pick one model?
Right. So as far as like demystifying the Chinese industrial policy is concerned, I kind of alluded to a lot of the approach a little bit already, which is this kind of every 5-year plan. They have like these 5-year plan rhythms, right? So it's not like an accident that 2025 is the goal, because they were talking about it in like the mid 2010s. And now actually, I think probably next month, they're going to release some more specifics in terms of the next phase of this final 5-year plan. And that is very much kind of a top-down approach in terms of signaling, in terms of money, right? If you were to talk to venture capitalists who are in China, or just like hedge funds or investors and whatnot, they are, at least the good ones, are very astute at reading signals from the top to direct their own private dollars, which could be actually, money from all over the world. Like they fundraise from endowments in America, just like everybody else. And there's government subsidies that are tied to a lot of these directional things the government picks. And, the 8 areas that I outlined a little bit previously, like blockchain and AI and cloud computing, all these sorts of things, that is kind of how they execute a lot of this stuff. And there are definitely pros and cons to that approach. So I'm not endorsing it one way or another, but that is in a nutshell how the economy and the investment flow kind of works in there. And that boils into domestic kind of public markets in China as well, right? Whether it's like the Shanghai exchange or the Shenzhen exchange. So that's what's going on over there. Now, for the United States side, the funny thing is, the internet was a Department of Defense thing, right? Like if you trace back to TCP/IP and all the very kind of building blocks of what we use as the internet, a lot of it was, all of it actually was driven by government initiatives and spending. Semiconductor, how Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor came about, those were all defense contracts and kind of like Defense Department initiatives that are just executed differently. And I think the only difference is that we as a government or as a system, even we just don't like announce it in that way, right? We're like, yeah, we're gonna like do our thing. And even the 5G conversation, one of the kind of the roadblocks is the Defense Department kind of opening up the radio bandwidth of 5G. So we have like the pipe, like I talked about, right? To be available, to be built, to have a 5G cellular network. Now, coming back to your question, Tim, about, should we have a more overt industrial policy that is government driven? I'd say we need to play to our strength, right? Which is obviously we shouldn't do what China's doing, and regardless of how effective that is. I think the government in general, whether it's Congress or the executive branch should take a stronger point of view, at least in terms of where do we want our technology and our industries to go. And I think those directions are actually very obvious at this point, kind of massively exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but even previous to that is quite obvious. And there are certain kind of bills that are happening in Congress right now. I think a couple of months ago, there was like a $22 billion subsidy program for semiconductor manufacturing specifically that was making its way through Congress, right? Which I think these are very good signs of that happening. But I would say, given that we are a free market economy at the end of the day, I would love to see some more ownership from the government, like literally perhaps like be a shareholder of some of these important strategic industries and players, whether it's the Qualcomms or Cisco's or whatever we want to incubate out of the world, right? Previously, we've been doing it via loans, right? Like Tesla got a energy department loan back in the days, which it has repaid early because it worked out, right? There are other less successful stories like Solyndra that didn't work out. And you get kind of panned for that in the media if you're the administration doing it, which the Obama administration was. So we got kind of panned for that. But those are the kind of chances, I think, that only governments can really take and shouldn't be punished for it. And there's models of that in Germany. Like German governments do take shares in their kind of big companies in exchange for subsidy, in exchange for support. And, there were proposals of that during COVID as well, when, instead of printing money, they're trying to figure out how do we support our own economy and our own companies. They're like, part of that is that we're going to give you this money to help you, but we're going to take an ownership piece of it. And then we're just a shareholder, right? And that pays back the taxpayers when it works out, which is really a win-win, but we haven't really done that in America. And that will be one approach I think is much more playing to our strength than what some of these other East Asian economies specifically have been doing. Kind of works for them, it may not work for us.
Yeah. So Kevin, you've been in government, and I'm not going to use the bad word here, but literally in August, there seemed to be this F China policy through the Trump administration. Literally, it was reported that staffers and department heads were naming the policy F China. Is this like the beginning of an even more toxic level of policy approach, or is this just political rhetoric that fades away as elections fade away? Have you heard this F China concept?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is, so I think there are a couple layers to that, right? One is that I think one thing that the Trump administration discovered is that a very aggressive policy towards China, first in terms of tariff, and then in terms of technology sanctions on the Huawei's of the world, is effective for two reasons. One is that it advances their political standing and their agenda domestically. Two is that it actually does hurt them as well, which, to be honest, no one has really tried it previous to the Trump administration. People have maybe threatened it in meetings behind closed doors and stuff like that, but they're the first ones that actually did it. And I think from their kind of more short-term view, at least in the next, 50 odd days or so, they're seeing that as a very important tool, a very powerful tool, both in terms of messaging, both in terms of perception on the campaign trail to be tough on China, which is frankly always a winning message, whether you like it or not, and also actually hurt the Chinese economy. They see that as an advantage. So F China is a very crude way of describing it, and that's how they describe it internally. So we didn't make it up. But I think it's much more real than rhetoric, at least in the short term, because there are actual tangible benefits to their political calculus heading into re-election. And it's very hard to know, like, say if Trump wins re-election, whether that kind of behavior would continue or subside because they no longer have the re-election kind of second round of battle hanging around them.
Yeah. Kevin, so let's go back to the participants in the audience. Let me paraphrase. It's basically China's coming out of COVID, and that's great, and they've done a great job of getting through that. but the US companies are now evaluating non-Chinese options for manufacturing, both for health and political reasons. Do you see this as just a temporary issue or potentially a permanent shift in that manufacturing base? And how does that impact the kind of your overall context of what you're sharing?
I think it will be a permanent shift, but it will be a very, very slow shift because these relationships are very hard to unwind and to look for other options and alternatives, right? Because the one thing that the Chinese economy and the Chinese manufacturing base has done really well is not just to be a cheap supplier of stuff that can be afforded to be cheap, but actually pretty high valued kind of manufacturing capabilities for products that need to be good quality. So manufacturing quality in Shenzhen, for example, in Foxconn facilities, wherever they're mysteriously located, are very good. And you see Apple trying to replicate that in India a few years ago, just to, number one, kind of enter the India market because it's very big, but also to probably diversify that dependency a little bit. And it's been really difficult to replicate that in India because they don't have that knowledge. They don't have the reps, right? They don't have the institutional experience and the operational excellence. And there are all these things that have to come into play to make an iPhone really well, or even a Samsung phone, for example. And Apple wouldn't be okay to compromise on that. Their lower end phones like Samsung and Xiaomi, which is a Chinese manufacturer, ironically enough, that will be okay to manufacture in India. So as an example to illustrate just how hard it is to decouple those links, and those links have been built in the last 20 years or so, and is kind of part of the reason why the American kind of advanced manufacturing is being hollowed out a bit, because of the arbitrage, because of the profit opportunity it is to offshore a lot of this stuff, right? So will it happen in like 15 years? I think it has to, because of the problem that COVID has exposed in terms of why do we not have our own supply of masks and like basic pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. And those are lower end manufacturing capabilities. So I think onshoring that back to America is easier than say electronics or like consumer electronics and those kind of things. So you kind of see probably a kind of a separation. A different industry will try to do that in different pace, but it kind of has to happen. And the pace and the speed of that, again, coming back to your point, it depends on how interested is the American government in supporting those kind of things.
Yeah. Hey, Michelle, put up the next survey on how concerned are people with their data privacy with China. The TikTok, they're going to own our data and they're going to do what with it? I think they're just going to serve up, more ads. And then while folks are taking this particular survey, because I'm very curious to see the response, talk about, you shaped this very well, Kevin, this paradigm between US style stimulus in the form of QE, because it's easy here. It doesn't require Congress. And we put $4 trillion of QE on top of good stimulus for COVID. And China uses mostly fiscal policy for the hard-hitting, heavy-duty stuff. They have QE too. I mean, they have their form of monetary policy. But their latest version, and you alluded to it, was the new infrastructure stimulus plan. Kind of briefly explain that, and what areas will that impact, so we can gain some insight maybe on directing investment capital into those areas.
Right. So a couple of things. One is that another element I didn't mention about the American style of QE and why it, let's just say, works, at least temporarily, has to do with the fact that the dollar is still the global reserve currency, right? That is kind of the prerequisite for something like that working without biting us in the butt, at least immediately. And we don't have to get into the future speculation of that per se. And I'm sure China or other countries would have loved to have that option available. It's just that nobody does, right? Like China tried to get the RMB into the global circulation, to have it be used more. And it just, people wouldn't take it because they don't trust the government, right? Because it's a government faith thing when it comes to currency. So that is uniquely available to America. Which is why they have to look for other areas of growth. And this new infrastructure plan that you talked about, the 8 areas that is explicitly focused on is AI, 5G, cloud computing, Internet of Things, AR, VR, blockchain, autonomous devices, and industrial internet. So most of these are quite self-explanatory, right? If you look at investment opportunities. So cloud computing is like pretty basic. Like if you look at a cloud company, if you look at companies that are building data centers, that's going to be in growth area, right? 5G, obviously Huawei, but other kind of suppliers or customers actually of this boom. So the 3 big Chinese telecom companies, right? China Unicom and Telecom, I think is the other one. And there's like another smaller one. They are building 5G base stations as we speak. They're like 1 year into it already. It's like a 3-year thing that they're doing. And then Internet of Things and autonomous vehicle, there are a few Chinese kind of autonomous vehicles and also electric vehicles already coming on the market. They just listed on the NASDAQ. They are going public domestically in China as well. So there are all these opportunities where people can be a part of that. And one thing I do want to just kind of double click on, which is blockchain. I know it's kind of like a iffy subject for a lot of people, but it's incredibly relevant coming back to the dollar reserve currency issue, right? Because the way the Chinese central government, the central bank, actually the People's Bank of China is thinking about blockchain is this alternative financial instrument, this financial infrastructure that it could lead in developing to kind of both empower itself, internationally speaking, but also weed away some of this dollar-pegged dominance that America has. So that kind of goes into maybe the kind of the previous regional dominance question, right? Like, is there like a play there? I think there could be. We are seeing merchants between China and Latin America using cryptocurrency to pay each other, as opposed to the dollar or the RMB. They're like, we're gonna use cryptocurrency instead of these fiat currencies. And a lot of the cryptocurrencies are actually dollar pegged. So still more dollar than China, but it's a little bit different now. So that's the kind of space that I personally have been watching closely. I haven't written a lot about it because I'm still trying to learn the technical aspect of cryptocurrency, but just to put a pin for everybody who's interested in kind of like monetary policy, right? There's an element of that.
Yeah. All right. So we had the poll results again. You know, people are concerned about data sharing, and that's pretty intuitive. So let me just ask a little bit more of a political question, a little less away from technology. This is from one of our participants. You know, what's your view on the future of Taiwan's independence? I mean, we know that China has specifically developed military equipment to address a Taiwanese kind of, I hate to use the word invasion, but a seaboard invasion. They built all that specific capabilities. I think what defense folks will call it. I call it military equipment, airplanes, boats, supply chains, all of that. Talk about your view on the future of Taiwan's independence, which is a little bit off topic, right? But let's get into it a little.
There's definitely a technology element to that, which I can bring in if you'd want.
Please
right.
do.
Well, I think the reason why it's becoming actually an issue. So first of all, I mean, the Taiwanese, the mainland Taiwan situation is a long-standing conflict. It's actually one of the few remnants of the Cold War. Right, the other being North Korea, South Korea, right? Everything else kind of just like sorted out the way it sorted out, and then that's the end of it. And the only reason why it's becoming a bigger issue, number one, obviously Taiwan elected a president, Tsai Ing-wen, who is very overtly pro-independence as opposed to say pro-status quo. Those are the two distinctions of the relationship between mainland and Taiwan. No one, at least to my knowledge, in Taiwan has ever ran for president saying we're going to become a part of the People's Republic of China. right? That's just like a non-starter. So it's either like we're gonna maintain this weird relationship currently, and we're just gonna develop our economy and make money, or we're gonna be more overtly politically independent. So the reason why it's becoming more concerning now is actually because of the Taiwanese chip foundry, TSMC, that I alluded to earlier. The Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is quite literally the single point of failure right now in the entire world when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing. Because number one, it's incredibly good. It's the market leader by a fairly long shot. It is advancing extremely rapidly, so much so that America has asked this company to build a chip foundry in Arizona, which is something that came up the last few months or so. And because the entire world runs on technology, which means it has to run on these processing chips, these CPUs or GPUs or semiconductors that TSMC makes so well, all the top suppliers, all the top tech companies, Apple, Samsung, NVIDIA, AMD, and even Intel, all their orders are residing on this little island right now. And that makes the island's strategic importance just way bigger than it ever was, frankly. So coming back to your kind of like military equipment angle to it, right? I don't think China was ever concerned about Taiwan invading the mainland after like the 70s. Like it was a concern like previous to that era, and Taiwan has been concerned about a mainland invasion since like forever, right? There's a reason why Taiwan has this mandatory kind of military conscription system for its young men. It's been happening for a long time. Same for South Korea because they're defending against North Korea, right? So that's the system. And of course, Taiwan buys a lot of military equipment from the US. And the complaint, quite frankly, until recently, was that Taiwan has been getting kind of like the old generation of US military equipment, and they weren't so happy about it, but they didn't really have much of a choice. And now there's a lot of talk in Congress about selling them better stuff, basically, because we're actually worried that this potential hot war could occur. So kind of coming back to your audience's question about Taiwanese independence, it's always been independent by, you know, de facto independent is what we call it, as opposed to say de jure independent, which is like by law independent. So it's been doing its thing for a very long time. And the people there are very, they're just different. And if you look at like recent surveys of people in Taiwan, they are less and less inclined to be closer to the mainland and more willing to really be overtly independent, especially the younger generation, which on the one hand could be a problem if this is a spark for conflict, but on the other hand, they are probably exerting themselves more than they've ever been. So that is something that is where we're headed. And it's hard to know where this thing is going because it is so, it's actually quite concerning in my head, like how bad this could be. And there's all these people about like people, that the October surprise, right, that every election season has, could be a quote unquote conflict in either Taiwan or the South China Sea. But you know, if it's an October surprise, then I'm not too worried about it because that's just a political ploy. And when we decide who the next president is, that will be over. But if it's something more serious, if something that's like congressional, then there's probably like longer implications to that.
Yeah. So Kevin, I know folks might want to drop off at 1 hour. I'm going to see if I can hold you for a little bit because I want to rapid fire some stuff. SMIC is a very large chip manufacturer in China. It happens to be in one of our China A SMA accounts. You recently wrote about the failure point with Taiwan Semiconductor and not being able to sell into China. And I just recently read that China just flew a bunch of airplanes over to Taiwan, loaded up the bus, flew them back, basically to give Huawei and others 10 to 12 months of chip supply. And I don't know all the technicals, but you wrote about the fact that it's this whole Trump trade tech war, so to speak, could force China's hand into accelerating their semiconductor development. And you even talked about some of the subsidy they may put into the trillions of dollars, maybe over $1 trillion of government subsidy to build out that semiconductor capacity. Talk about a little about your latest post.
Yeah. So SMNC is what I will coin the national champion of semiconductor manufacturing, right? So coming back to this concept of national champion, Huawei is like the telecom national champion, and SMNC is the semiconductor chip national champion. And it's been, so SMNC, funny enough, used to be listed on the NASDAQ, right? And then it got delisted and then came back to China to be listed again with a more friendly environment, more government investment up to the billions. And right now, the latest figure is $1.4 trillion from the very top for the next 5 years. So into the 2025 timeframe that focuses on semiconductor capability building, which SMNC will probably get a good chunk of that. And I think they've been pushed to accelerate this a lot faster because of the tech Cold War or the trade war or the sanctions, because I think they probably thought they had more time. To be honest, it wasn't like they just thought this was a problem that they needed to address. They've been thinking about it, but because the sanctions against Huawei and also, this chip foundry has been so aggressive, and one of the element of how this is aggressive is really like almost it's already like flowed into borders beyond America. The most important company here is a Dutch company called ASML, which produces so-called lithography equipment. So these are just like equipments that make the chip. Right? These are like electronic equipments. They're very high end. And this one Dutch company has the best state-of-the-art equipment by a long shot. And SMNC supposedly tried to acquire equipments from this company and more or less got blocked because the Trump administration lobbied the Dutch government to tell it not to sell to this Chinese national champion. Right? So they're getting hit probably left and right at the moment, which in the short term will be terrible for them. But I think this is just gonna kind of push them to really kind of dig their heels deeper into R&D and basic research to develop their own technology. And one thing we haven't talked about, which is open source technology. And
let's
that will
transition that. Yeah.
Right, that will be a huge element or a huge, I would say, component of this set of solutions they have to pursue. So open source technology, for those of you who haven't heard about it before, is literally a source code of technology that is open to the world, anybody to run, to deploy, to copy, and to distribute. And this was actually more of a political statement from people who did not like Microsoft back in like the 80s, because they were the dominant monopoly, right, of technology, specifically of software. Now, you can look on my blog for open source details. I wrote a lot about it, so I won't belabor it here because we're running out of time. But the gist of it is that open source technology being free, being available, being really just like there, could be used as a foundation for these Chinese manufacturers and companies to leverage, to accelerate their pace towards self-sufficiency, as opposed to R&Ding it behind closed doors, or try to acquire this technology through like forced technology transfer, which they do a lot, right, via joint ventures and stuff like that, which now is more or less off the table for a lot of these things because the sanctions have been so aggressive.
So Kevin, like Red Hat, I think, was open source technology in response to Microsoft. What's the name of the leading open source technology platform in China that could be used? I think you mentioned it once. I just forgot the name of it. Or is there a name for it?
There is, yeah. So the way to think about it is that there are these kind of applications that host open source code, right? It's just like a place where you put it. It's almost like a Google Drive, but for code. The dominant one is GitHub. which is owned by Microsoft. It used to be a very high-flying, fast-growing Silicon Valley startup. So that's like where 90% of the open source code is hosted and also collaborated upon. So you can see the code base evolve in the open, again, transparently over time as things get better, stronger, whatever. And recently, China decided to, again, kind of anoint its open source national champion, and it's called Gitee. So it's Gitee, so 2 E's in the end. And Gitee is more or less like a GitHub clone with some Chinese flavors, obviously Chinese characters and all these sorts of things. It's functionally the same thing, but this is, in my attempt in reading this, a way to control some of the open source technology that's out there, which is actually antithetical to open source itself, because it's supposed to be out there where no one controls. There's no vendor that controls it, right? Like Red Hat doesn't control the open source core Linux that it makes money from. Anybody can make money off of Linux, the operating system. It's just that Red Hat was the best at it. And that's the reason why it became a big company. Yep. So there are a lot of contradictions to that. That is, in my opinion, one of the most important trends that we need to look at in terms of how far and how quickly China's technological advancement can go.
So final question before we let you go. President Xi was on a video conference with Europe yesterday and Angela Merkel. And I don't know if you, and they were trying to hammer out the details of this bilateral trade agreement between the EU and China. And in some sense, it builds this Eurasia kind of trading partner that doesn't require sea lanes. And that destabilizes US military's, the US Navy strength that has controlled the sea lanes for 300 years. Is there more to that Eurasia? Is that vision part of President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party's view of accessing, frankly, the largest conglomerate bloc in the world, which is the EU?
Right. So first of all, I have not seen that video chat or reporting on it. So I will take your word for it as that it obviously happened, right?
Well, it hasn't been done yet, but they're definitely talking and hope to have it done by year end. What does that do if they strike a deal with Europe for direct bilateral trade?
Right. I think that is a pretty tectonic shift, to be honest with you, when it comes to the entire balance of power, coming back to like traditional foreign affairs, the balance of power in the whole world. Because one, it's a tangible boost to the Belt and Road Initiative that's been happening in China, which is literally people building roads and railways west of China, right? So if you have your mental map in there, it's like into the Kazakhstans, the Kyrgyzstans, into Central Asia, into the Middle East, into Turkey, and eventually connecting to Europe and also to Africa. There's a lot of that going on as well. And if that path of trade were to be opened with quite a big customer in Germany on the other end, this is a huge shift in terms of actually Europe's own economy and dependency on the United States. That's another element that we don't talk about, which is that the Trump administration's tariff, the tariff wars have been going up, not just for China, but for Europe constantly. Right. And for even Canada. Recently, there was like an aluminum tariff that's like 2% or 10% or something like that with our neighbors in the north. And all these walls in terms of tariffs are erecting all around us. And Europe, frankly, has a much less resilient and a much less dynamic economy than China and the United States. It's been aging, it's not been growing very quickly, and they want to change that perception and that reality as well. And this very much could be what at least Chancellor Merkel is saying in terms of getting their economy out of the whole like FUD. And just to kind of double click on your audience's response when it comes to kind of data privacy concern, to tie that all back together, Europe has a much more nuanced view towards what Chinese technology does with my data in terms of a kind of a consumer level privacy protection. Number one, because they actually have a framework called GDPR, which we don't. So they kind of know what they're doing as far as like protecting data is concerned. So they have a better framework, frankly, than we do. So they're probably not as concerned. They're not like as easily scared, right? Like if you're gonna sell your Huawei phone to Europe, fine, sell it. You have to, abide by GDPR. If you don't, we're gonna find the crap out of you. And this is how we deal with it, right? So they will look at technology for what it is, as opposed to what we think it could be. So they're probably just like less concerned about doing business with Chinese companies than say we do right now.
So Kevin, I hate to do this to you, but I'm a tequila fan, and like when you have a really good sip of tequila, you want another one. So this is what I call the final.
I'm around.
So final. Is TikTok this is from one of our participants. Is TikTok a Trojan horse? Should consumers and the U.S. government really be that concerned about TikTok?
I think TikTok is probably more of a collateral damage because of all this other larger problems that or the larger tension that we are experiencing between the United States and China. Because the funny thing with TikTok is there's so many easier ways to verify whether TikTok is a Trojan horse than how we're doing it right now. And I've written about this before, which is that if TikTok were to be this secret tool that the Chinese government deployed into the America culture, literally, right, to spy on all of us, right? We could just verify that very easily because TikTok, the American version of the app that we use here, they live on AWS, which is Amazon. They live on Google Cloud, and they may now live on Oracle Cloud. Regardless of which cloud they live on, these are American companies. And the data center that store these clouds are physically in America. Probably a bunch of them are in Portland or in Oregon, just because that's where a lot of these data centers are. We could just go in there and verify the logs of data transfer from this app to see if anything is being sent over to China. So, so to like appease, I don't want to like say they're not scary because I think it is a bit concerning. Like I see weird things on TikTok all the time because I play around with it for fun. To be like, why did it get pushed this weird tourism video about Guangzhou when all I was looking at was like, Kevin Hart lip syncing or like comedy clips, right? Like these two things do not match based on my very basic understanding of algorithmic recommendation engines, right? So possibly, but there are better ways for us to understand that issue than how we're dealing with it right now. So, I don't want to say that it is or it's not. It's just that we shouldn't even be wondering about this. There's such an easy way to verify that. Is it or is it not, right? And that will be a much better way to regulate all apps coming from everywhere, from Russia, from China, from Iran, our adversaries, quote unquote, or just benign ones from Canada or from Germany and be like, is it taking American user data to do nefarious things?
Yeah. So, Kevin, before I thank you. All our participants will send out a survey, feedback survey, and we hope you fill that out. Kevin, hey, listen, this has been awesome. Really peeling back the onion on this tech dispute we're having, what it means in the big picture, the China presence in the world. As you know, we're growing our China fund and exposing US investors to more Chinese domestic companies. We're loving that experience. We don't overweight it, obviously, because there's risk inherent, but you opened our eyes and our minds to understanding that dynamic. I hope we can have you back maybe after the election and as some of the policy takes hold and see what happens. Kevin, thank you. I hope you stay safe and enjoy some fresh air up there in Tahoe. To all our guests, thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us this afternoon, and be safe and be healthy. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, and reach out to me anytime you want to kind of deep dive on any of the things that we've talked about.
Love it. Thank you, Kevin. Best of luck.
Yep.